In Canada, 76% of business owners plan to exit their company within the next decade, representing over $2 trillion of business assets changing hands. Only about 1 in 10 owners actually have a succession plan in place. And when business owners think about selling, they quickly discover that the biggest challenges are finding a buyer, understanding what the business is actually worth, and building a company that can operate without them. Gerry, welcome to the Personal CFO Podcast.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Can you give a brief introduction about yourself and what you do?
Sure. So I'm a growth and value strategist or a wealth and exit planner. I work with owner-managed companies doing between $25 and $5 million in annual revenue. And I basically help them get ready for the day when eventually they're going to want to exit their business and make sure that they don't leave millions of dollars on the table. I'm a CPA, but I've been a CFO, CIO, a COO, and a CEO of national and multinational companies. Taken 2 of those companies public, one on the NASDAQ, one on the venture exchange, and I've opened up over 10 countries for different companies. So I formed my own company 27 years ago, and for those 27 years, I've been bringing my experience in terms of running companies well to the table to help business owners make sure they get full value on the day that they decide to exit their companies.
Can you tell the listeners, whoever's listening to this right now, assuming they're business owners, they might be running a business, they might want to sell a business one day, like why is it important to talk about business growth, business exit planning, right now? Why should they listen to this?
Well, first of all, they should always be planning for their exit because whether they like it or not, someday they will exit their business. Hopefully it's on their own terms. But unfortunately, sometimes there's health issues, there's divorce, there's whatever comes up that means that your exit is not planned, but is forced upon you. So you can't wait till that moment to start planning for your exit. You got to do it now because it's for most companies, it's a 3 to 5 year exercise to really get their company in a good shape to make sure they get max value when they exit.
So that's leading up to the second question, which is who is this conversation for ideally?
Ideally, well, as I keep saying, it's for every business owner. Every business owner should be thinking about this. But if you're in your mid to late 50s, 60s, you've been running your business for 20, 30 years, you still enjoy it, but you know what? Your time is limited in terms of how much time you have now to get your business ready. One of the sad things we see happening so many times, the statistics will bear me out, 80% of businesses that go to market never sell. And so if you're planning on a retirement that involves getting cash value out of your company, you don't wait till the last minute to start thinking about that. You've got to start planning that right now.
So the earlier, the better.
Earlier, the better. I always say the best time to start thinking about how to exit your company is the day you form your company. The second best time is when you talk to me. The worst time is when you decide, now's my time to leave and I want to sell.
There's definitely parallels with other aspects like investing. The best time to start was yesterday or 20 years ago, and the second best time is now.
I know. I know. When you look back at your portfolio now and you go, gosh, if only I'd done this when I was 21.
Yeah. With this conversation, we're going to get into the topics shortly, but how are we going to be able to help someone who's listening to this conversation today? What are we going to be able to leave them with?
Well, so hopefully we'll be able to leave them with a much better understanding of how you create value in your company. Because most business owners, and I say this generally speaking, most business owners believe that I've got revenue and I've got profit, therefore I'll be able to sell my company anytime I want to. And there's a huge difference between profit and revenue growth and value. And that's one of the things we will be discussing today. So hopefully that will give them some insights and also a mindset shift. There's a mindset shift that has to happen for business owners where they stop looking at their business solely as a revenue generator and start looking at their business as a value generator. And those two are very different.
Okay, let's circle back to this before the end of the episode because I think that's very important. Okay, awesome. Let's start. Let's dive into it. So the first question is anyone who's building a business that is sellable, and we'll start there, that is actually sellable. What is the term transferable value, which you refer to in your strategic reports? What does that actually mean?
Transferable value is the value that's inherent to the business so that when a buyer acquires a business, that value goes with the business or stays with the business. Right? So examples of that would be customers with long-term contracts, recurring revenue streams, policies and procedures that are well documented, senior leadership team that's in place that will stay with the business when the business gets sold. What isn't transferable is what's inside the owner's head. So if everything in the business goes through the owner, if all decisions go back to the owner, if the owner knows all the procedures and how things work and just makes it work, answers all the challenges, that's not transferable. So to a buyer, they look at that and go, that's a piece of value that is not transferable. Therefore, I am not going to pay for that. And so transferable value is what a buyer can see will stay with the business when the business transfers over.
Okay. What type of businesses do you see that tend to be more exposed to that risk where everything lives kind of in the owner's head
Huh.
from just your experiences?
Yeah, so generally speaking, it applies to almost every business. It applies more to businesses that are in the starting phase of going from 5 to 10 to 15 million in revenue, because you can't grow past that without actually starting to put in procedures and a whole bunch of things. In my work, though, I tend to deal primarily with people who are in their late 50s, early 60s. They've had their businesses for 20 or 30 years. So they tend to not be SaaS businesses or IT businesses, but they tend to be manufacturing, distribution. They make something, they distribute something, a real physical.
I see. Okay. Talking about business valuation, we're going to dive into more detail, shortly. But why do you think most business owners overestimate the value of their business?
You know what? That's really simple, because first of all, they don't know what their business is really worth. And so what do they rely on? So they read an article about a company that's in their industry that sold for 6 times EBITDA. And they go, well, my company's way better than that. So if they got 6, I'm going to be able to get 8. And they look at their EBITDA and they go 8 times 2 million, I'm worth $16 million. Or a friend sold a company or whatever. But that's their benchmark for valuing their company. And they always feel like it's worth more, right? Analogy I always use: your neighbor's house goes up for sale, goes on market. What's the first thing everybody in the neighborhood does? They go to the listing and they see what the price is that they're asking. And right away they go, oh, my house is much nicer than theirs. Therefore, if they're selling theirs for $1.5 million, my house is worth 2 million for sure. It doesn't work that way, right? As we all know. And it's the same thing with businesses, but it's just a natural tendency for owners to want to say, or to believe, that their business is worth more than it is. And as I mentioned earlier, this false notion that just because they have profit, they're going to be able to sell their business is a huge barrier to what their valuation is, which is why I always advise any owner, they need a value benchmark. It's interesting, isn't it, Guillaume, that they will measure all kinds of KPIs. They will measure revenue growth. They will measure inventory turns. They will measure cash flow. They will measure receivables, all of that stuff, and profit and revenue. And they never measure value, because the only way they can measure value is by having either a valuation done, or at least a benchmark valuation that says, here's what your business is actually really worth in the marketplace, my friend. And these are the areas and these are the value gaps that you need to fill if you want to get max values. Story you heard about that company selling for 6 times or 8 times multiple, you'll be lucky right now to get 2. And here are the things you need to do. But they never, this concept of value and being different than revenue generation and profit is one that most business owners don't think of.
Yeah. Side question here. How often do you think a business owner should go about maybe going through like a thorough analysis of the value of their business throughout their journey? I understand, 4 to 5 years before selling or as you get closer to selling, but from your experience, is this kind of a weekly a cadence that a business owner should go through this exercise instead of just relying on the kind of like rule of thumb and estimates?
Absolutely. I mean, when I work with a client, we do a valuation minimum once a year. Minimum once a year. Now, being clear, there's so many different kinds of valuations.
Yeah. Sure.
The valuation I'm talking about is not a valuation that you're going to take to that you can take to divorce court at the CRA. It's not done by a CPV, but it's not costing you $20,000 or $30,000 to get. And as part of my work, I just do it as part of my work. So every year we get a new valuation. But if you don't measure it, how can you know if you're having a positive impact or not? So I say at a minimum annually, you should get some kind of valuation benchmark done by somebody who knows what they're doing, an outside pair of eyes.
And because from the reports that you've shared with me, a lot of the valuation work that you do is also identifying all the gaps and the opportunities,
Yes,
which is also ultimately tied to the exit value, right? So it all comes together. So the more you do it on an annual basis, then you can probably see the improvements or the lack of improvements if there's not, if it's not implemented properly and whatnot. Right?
yeah, exactly. As I said, if you don't measure it, you have no way of managing it, and they all know
Makes sense.
that, but they
That's
don't.
it. Yeah.
They don't measure it, right? And an example, we'll come back to it when we're talking
Yeah.
about more about valuations and stuff, but
Yeah.
very
Okay.
critical to get those, because otherwise you have no idea.
Yeah, every year. So it's like everything else essentially, right? Whether you want to track, if you, the only way to measure progress is to have the right metrics that
Yeah,
will be able to allow you to measure that if you're making any progress.
exactly.
Makes sense. At a high level, about the deal killers or the killers of the value itself. Can you touch on them as far as what
Deal
is
killer
reducing? Yeah.
Deal killers is a good terminology because there are
Yeah.
some deal killers. The biggest one and the one we see most often is, as I called it earlier, owner concentration, where everything goes through the owner. The owner is at the center of everything. And it's interesting, when they eventually, if they're not properly trained to do it right, when they finally get to the point where they've got a transaction on the table, the buyer will ask, well, do you have any really big customers that that are critical? And they're proud of the fact that yes, they have this big customer. They've had him for 15 years. They've got a personal relationship. They go golfing together. They do, right? And to the owner, that's something to be proud of, and that's something that has value. To the buyer, that is all risk, because once the owner is gone, who's golfing with the customer? Who's taking care of the customer? Nobody else knows the customer in the business. So that's an example of where owner concentration, where the owner really feels like this is a good thing I'm doing, but from a value perspective, it might not.
Yeah, that's interesting. You would think like a deep relationship. I've heard that in my sector industry as well, where if an advisor, depending on, of course, you want to have a deep relationship with your clients, but sometimes it can be really difficult to replace that depth of a relationship when maybe you're transferring someone like, a financial advisor would transfer their book of clients to a new advisor. Now you need to recreate that relationship. I mean, again, that can go different ways, right? So that's kind of what you're alluding to in terms of how close they are integrated they are with their customer. That might be really actually hard to pass on
Yeah,
to the
I
next
mean,
owner operator.
but nothing wrong with having a good
No,
relationship with your
yeah,
clients, right? But if it's a crutch, it's something that the only reason they're still there is because of you. That's a risk to a buyer.
makes sense. Makes sense. Okay. Let's move on to what you cover in your reports. So it's the strategic capacity. So can you explain? So what is strategic capacity, and what does it matter for the valuation of a business?
Yeah, so strategic capacity comes back to what I've been chatting about earlier about the difference between growth and revenue and value. So strategic capacity is really a measurement of your ability to grow profitable business combined with your ability to grow value. And as I said, they're two different things. So you have to look at them separately. We combine them and then we benchmark that against an industry standard for your industry. And that gives us your strategic capacity. If you're at the top end of growth and you're at the top end of value creation, you're going to have a growth capacity of 90 to 95. But if you're like most companies, you're going to end up doing reasonably well on the ability to grow profitable business. We hope. If you're not delivering profitable business, then forget it. It's not a whole lot to talk about. But where they usually fail is on the value creation, right? And the value creation are things like, people ask me, well, what are you talking about, Gerry? What do you mean by value creation versus revenue and growth? What else can there be? It's things like IP protection. Have you got IP? If you do have IP, is it protected? Have you patented it? Do you know your industry? I will ask questions like, well, where do you sit in your industry? Are you a top performer or a poor performer? I don't know because I've never looked at my industry. I don't know what my market size is. Well, those are all value droppers. They reduce your value. And then do you have a good strategic story? So when a buyer walks in, can you explain your business in a coherent fashion that displays the journey you've been on, where your profit margins are, how you stand up in your industry, are your margins higher or lower than your competitors? Do you have any advantages? And then when they do due diligence, that story ends up being coherent. In other words, the story matches what they find when they look at evidence. Like those are the kind of things that build tremendous value. If you don't have them, they reduce value in the buyer's eyes.
I think you have one of the great quote on your reports as well is the value is what a buyer is willing to pay once they've done due diligence.
Of course. Of course. And different buyers are willing to pay for different things. So even when we do valuations, and the analogy I use is you want to sell your house. So you bring in 2 or 3 really good real estate agents who know their business. They measure up your house. They take pictures. They look at comparables. They look at trends and they come back and they say, look, we can probably sell your house for $1 million. Chances are you're going to sell your house somewhere around $1 million, but it depends on who the buyers are that show up. For one buyer, you've got a swimming pool. For one buyer, they go, oh, I'm never buying a house with a swimming pool. That's a terrible thing to have. Another buyer shows up and goes, swimming pool. I love having a swimming pool. Valuations, we don't know who the buyer is going to be. And at the end of the day, you're correct. It depends on the buyer, but also regardless of what buyer it is, If that swimming pool is cracked and leaking, it doesn't matter if the buyer really likes swimming pools, he's not buying that house, right? So it's the same thing with a business. They may be coming with a different motivation for looking at your business, but at the end of the day, if what they find doesn't suit what they're looking for, or it doesn't looks too risky, then they'll walk away anyway. So you got to have no matter what, you got to have a really good, solid business that can operate without it.
Makes sense. When you talk about the three dimensions of business growth in your report, can you walk the listeners through what are they?
Yeah. So there's three. Whenever I do work, and this is something I use a software platform called Growth Drive, which gives me all of this data, and I use their software platforms. I haven't invented it myself, but the first thing we want to look at is the foundation. So can you deliver profitable business today? So we want to look at, how are your margins? Have you got a leadership team? Have you got standard operating procedures? Again, is everything coming through you or not? Have you delegated authority? Do you have no concentration of customers? In other words, are your customers well dispersed? Do you have recurring revenues? So we want to make sure that you start with a solid foundation, because one of the mistakes a lot of growing companies make is they start to grow before their foundation is solid. And basically they're growing on a very fragile foundation.
House of cards.
House of cards, and that's not a good thing. So the first thing you want to do is you want to make sure your foundation is strong. Then the next phase is, okay, now that we've got a strong foundation, let's move towards growth. So now we start to look at sales process, marketing, where you stand in the industry and stuff like that. And once you demonstrated growth, then we get to that last phase, which is transferable value. Have you created transferable value with all of this? And have you got your IP in place? Have you got your strategic story? Do you know your market? Can you explain your market to a buyer? Right? Can you explain your competitive advantages to a buyer? And then is all of that supported by the evidence that they find when they do?
That makes sense. Okay. So as a pyramid, you start with predictable profits and cash flow. Then you're looking at your levers for sustainable growth. And then ultimately you get to your transferable value.
Exactly.
Which is okay.
Now, when we work on those things, I mean, they're not necessarily 100% linear.
Yeah.
Because one of the things when I work with clients, I start by doing a diagnostic course. I look at 24 areas of the business where I know buyers are going to do due diligence on, and let's see where the company currently stands. Sometimes I run into companies that are in pretty good shape. Most times there's some things that need to be fixed, and we identify those. And customers sometimes look at it and say, "Oh, yeah, I see now. I'm doing everything, and I got to get out of that of doing everything. So I've got to build a management team. So I'm going to start that tomorrow." And I kind of have to stop them and say, no. Before you can do that, you need, your management team has to have something to align to. So it would be really good if we started by making sure you've got your vision, your strategy, and your core competencies figured out, right? If you haven't got them, it would be really good if you had a structure in place that people could pick up and start to manage, as opposed to just walking in and everything is chaos. So we have to stage these things properly so they build one on top of each other. So sometimes we have to say, wait a minute, I know that's really important, but if you try doing that now, it's not going to work. There's a couple of building blocks that have to be put in place before you get to that.
The business blueprint. Like the business blueprint has to be established first. And then after that, the foundation, which just come back to the foundation piece. And then after that, you can start building up, right?
Exactly. Because sometimes I'll ask somebody, have you got a vision mission statement for your company? And they go, oh, I do. I said, can I see it? It's up here. Well, you haven't got one, right? If I can't walk down the hall and talk to Pete or Sally and ask them what the vision is for the company, and they go, you don't know, well, then you haven't got one, right?
Yeah.
They do. I asked them if they do weekly meetings where they review critical KPIs, cash, and whatever else with their management team. They go, oh, yes, we do that. I said, can I see the minutes? Oh, we don't keep minutes. I said, well, then you don't do meetings. You're a buyer, you don't do meetings. So these are kind of like simple things that you can start to look at, but you need to put in place first before you hit the big ones.
That makes sense. When you look at those three dimensions, we're going to get into value gap in a second, but what do you usually tend to see business owners neglecting?
Yeah, well, like I said, the big one we see almost all the time is this owner concentration. The owner is at the center of everything. Because when an owner starts a company, if you've started a company, you know this. In the start, you're doing everything, right?
I'm doing everything.
Exactly. You're doing everything. You have no choice. Right? You're doing everything. And that's how you grow, because you're doing everything and you get everything going. You got momentum and you don't have a lot of delays in decision making because you're making them all yourself, and everybody just follows orders and away you go. And then eventually, and this usually happens when you start to cross the $5 to $6 million revenue range, things start to get a little more difficult because all the decisions are coming to you still. Yet there's so many more decisions to be made, right? And eventually you start to feel the pressure and it's not fun anymore. And that's the point at which most owners, one of two things happen. Either they make that mindset shift and they go, I've got to stop being the hero of my company and I've got to start being the owner and the strategic manager of my company. And if they make that shift, then they move on to 10, 15, $20 million. If they don't make that shift, typically they stall. And as you know, if you're not growing, you're not staying still, you're shrinking.
You should, yeah. And you're the bottleneck, right? That's kind of what I'm hearing is you're the bottleneck, and then that value chain is maxed out. Like there's no much output that can kind of come out of that unless you start optimizing each parts, right? Which is what you're referring to here.
Exactly. And something else I'll mention, beyond, is that um, I always make this distinction. I always ask clients, are they looking to build a business that's an asset, or are they looking for a really nice job? You know, lifestyle companies versus a real company. And I always say there's absolutely nothing wrong with having a lifestyle company, right? You can have a nice company doing $2 or $3 million a year with a good set of customers. You're pulling in, $500,000, $750,000 a year in profit. You're living a good life, but you're never going to be able to sell that business, right? Versus, are you trying to build an asset so that someday when you decide you want to retire, now you've got an asset that you can sell for 10, 15, 20, $30 million. And depending on how you answer that question makes a big difference on how you run it.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Can you talk about that 5 million like benchmark? Why would you look at the revenue in terms of 5 million versus like gross profit? Because to me, the way I understand it is, yes, the revenue matters, but ultimately, if you have your cost that is bringing down your net profit or gross profit, depending how you define it, to three, 400, $300,000. I mean, someone making 5 million could have a net profit of 4 million, for example, if they have no.
Absolutely.
So how do you, yeah.
So remember, my benchmark is I'm trying to define my ideal customer. And so I've got to pick a metric, and typically revenue is the easiest one to pick, because if you're doing $5 million in revenue and you're doing 4 million in profit, or you're doing $5 million in revenue and you're doing a million in profit, the amount of work you're doing as the owner is probably the same. The things that you have to work on are pretty well the same, because you got to deliver $5 million worth of goods. You got to do this. You might be doing it better, but you still have to deliver the same stuff. So it's a benchmark I use. It's a benchmark. And the reason I use 5 million as my low point is because that's typically where an owner will have to start thinking about, I can't do everything anymore. I can't be at the center of everything. I've got to start figuring out how I change my dynamic here so that we can continue to grow. Under 5 million, like we talked earlier, you're just so consumed with making your business work every day that you haven't got time to talk to somebody.
To get to.
And there's no sense in talking to somebody who just doesn't have the bandwidth to go, oh yeah, it's a great idea. I'll get to it once I've finished delivering this product over here, and once I figure out my cash flow, and once I figured out my payroll for next week, and blah 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 blah.
I 100% echo that. You know what? When I reach out to people, and especially a lot of I do is business development and growing my business. And there's nothing worse, but I understand it. People are busy, but people who don't carve out the time for, let's say, something that it's really important, I can see how it's really important for them. But if they don't see it for themselves, it's really, really hard to get someone. I mean, they have to come to that realization that, hey, this needs to be prioritized. I do this on the personal side, but what you're referring to is like within the business. If they don't make this a priority within the business, I mean, there's only so much you can do, or we can do as advisors. That's what you're.
It's in that quadrant that they call critical but not urgent, and that's the quadrant that never gets attention.
Exactly. Yeah. Moving on to the value gap. So you've mentioned a few things, but let's dive into this. So what's the value gap, and why should business owners kind of care about it early, essentially? How should we?
Yeah. So here's what I call a value gap. So when I do my valuation and I do my assessment, so I will identify, as I said, those 24 areas. And let's say pick one area, I don't know, management team. So, and after we've talked over how it works, we score them at a low 5 versus a 1 on a scale of 1 to 5 in terms. So what my software can do as part of the valuation is it can say, oh, that 5 versus a 1 is costing you X in terms of multiple. Apply that multiple reduction against your EBITDA, and that tells you how much value you're leaving on the table because you're a 5 instead of a 1 in that space. So we can identify pretty clearly what it's worth to the owner to fix something, to fix a value gap. Right? And that's what I call value gaps. All it is it's saying, because of where you're positioned against your peers in the industry, against the best in class in your industry, in this particular part of your business, you've created a value gap. You're not at 100% of the value you could be getting out of it. And the interesting thing, is when I have this conversation and eventually we move on, I always like to say, all these value gaps have identified that you could be getting a multiple. I'm going to use some simple numbers here of 5, but instead you're getting a multiple of 1. Right. So if you don't fix those value gaps, you start growing your company and you add another $1 million in EBITDA in the next 3 years. What have you added to the value of the company? $1 million, because your multiple is 1. If you've changed your multiple to be 5, that same EBITDA is now worth $5 million eventually in your pocket. That's another concept that most owners don't quite grasp. And this is what I call the difference between creating value versus just creating revenue and profit.
That is different. Okay. And the goal of this exercise specifically, is it to order the priorities in terms of what the owner should address based on the biggest value gap opportunity that it can close? How else are you helping owners implement this or integrate this?
So at the end of the what I look at these are the areas where you're doing okay, right? Nobody's terrible at everything, otherwise you're not in business.
Yeah.
You're not making money. So here are the areas you're doing okay. Here are the areas that are impacting your profit or your growth or your value, and here are the deal killers. Right. So in some cases, we'll identify 2 or 3 items that, these are deal killers. Like, they're not just value gaps. If you don't fix this, you're not even going to be able to sell your company. Right. And as you know, 80% of companies don't sell at the end of the day. So we identify those 3 areas. And based on that, sometimes the deal killer is not the biggest value gap, believe it or not, in terms of value, but the deal killer. So it's like one of those things where if you don't fix this, then just forget it. And as I mentioned earlier, you also have to be careful that you stage these things in the right order. So the most valuable gap, yes, you start there, but then you also got to look at the full picture and see where are the best places to move.
When do you see business owners identifying the value gap opportunity? Does it tend to be too late? Does it tend to be right on time? Does it tend to be early from your experience?
What do you mean? When do they figure it out?
When do they, unless they've been through an exercise, with you and whatnot, but when do they tend to notice that first of all, there's a significant value gap here in some of the procedures or what they're doing, and then that they're missing out potentially on a lot more exit value when they want to exit or sell their business? Like, when do they tend to come to the realization that, oh, wow, there's a huge gap that I'm leaving on the table here?
Unfortunately, it tends to be when they are in a transaction.
Okay.
It tends to be, or when they've talked to, they decided they want to sell their company. So they reach out to an M&A advisor or a broker, and, the broker takes a look quickly and says, sorry, this is not going to work.
Wow.
And it's really unfortunate, because usually that's the point where they're so fed up with their business that they can't do it anymore, or they've had an event happen that causes them to have to sell their business, and they're at a complete disadvantage. And as to say, 80% of the time, they can't even sell the business. They just have to walk away.
Wow. Yeah. That's the value of planning early, right? It's so funny. It's like anything else. And it's like any other areas of, personal financial planning.
Absolutely. And I always say, what you know what you don't know. You don't know what you don't know. And it's that last category that these owners are in, because if they've never sold their business, they just do not know what's going to hit them when due diligence comes along. So if you don't know what you don't know, you can't fix it.
That's true.
So you really do need, this is the role of the wealth advisor. This is the role of the exit planner. This is the role of the lawyer. This is the role of the CPA. All these professionals that surround them to eventually, grab them and say, look, we got to pay attention to this.
Yeah. When you talk about making a business sellable, can you talk about the mindset that you've referred to earlier in the conversation, the mindset shift? Can you elaborate on that mindset shift in order to make that business, first of all, scalable, but sellable in the first place and also scalable?
Yeah, well, so the mindset shift I've talked about already. It's just a matter of understanding the difference between profits and value.
Okay,
right?
that is the one. Okay.
I mean, I can give you a real concrete example. So I did some work last year for a company out of Texas, right? They'd gotten an unsolicited offer, didn't know what to do with it. We worked with them. We identified how they were leaving $1.5 million on the table if they took the offer that was on the table. Here were their value gaps. The owner decided he was going to go fix these value gaps before So already the mindset shift is starting, right? So I redid a valuation 6 months later, and they had added $1 million to their valuation without a dollar more of EBITDA, just by fixing the gaps. But the biggest one, and this is the mindset shift, he managed to take a 17-day vacation with his son. And he left his foreman in charge of the business while he was away. He didn't get a single phone call, and he came back and the business was still running. The important thing is he said to me, he says, Gerry, he says, I could have done this before. He says, but I would never have done it before because I would have thought it was too risky. But once I understood that it was a critical component to building value in the company, now it was worth my while taking the risk. And that's the mindset shift.
That's a great example of what you referred to as removing yourself from the operations of the business. So instead of just focusing on revenue growth or profits, now you're able to remove yourself and then we're able to see a value increase because now the business was being more autonomous, so to speak, like with the current management team, the current procedures, the current, and everything that goes with it.
And now there's evidence because, you could have been in a due diligence
Right.
conversation with a buyer and you say, oh yeah, I could take a vacation anytime I want. And they go, well, when's the last time you took a vacation? Well, I haven't done it yet. That just doesn't work. But to say that I took a 17-day vacation, I've taken vacation every year. I always say to owners, can you be away from the business for at least 2 weeks over a payroll cycle? If you can be away for 2 weeks over a payroll cycle and not take calls while you're away, that's a good sign.
It's a good sign.
Yeah. And if we have time, I can provide a really simple way to be able to figure out and start to get yourself out of being in the day-to-day.
Please do.
You want to do that now?
Please do. Yeah.
So it's really simple. So to the owner, for the next 2 weeks, write down on a piece of paper every time one of your employees comes to you and asks for a question, asks for direction, asks for whatever. Write down every time a customer calls and asks for you instead of your salesperson or somebody else in the organization. And at the end of the 2 weeks, take a look at that list. And I guarantee you will go, why do they keep coming to me for that question? Surely that's something I could give to somebody else, give away the authority to do something on my behalf so I don't have to do it. It's small. It's a starting point. And then go to the next one, and then go to the next one and you do this every 3 or 4 months until, all of a sudden you do one for 2 weeks and nobody's come to ask you a question.
I like this exercise. You're empowering your employees essentially,
Yes.
And you're trying to close the loop instead of always defaulting to maybe that was the easiest probably action that they were doing in the past. And then now you're just trying to close that loop.
You always had the answer.
So now trying to empower others to have the answer, or maybe helping them find the answers themselves, or maybe document it, like you mentioned, right? Try to optimize that process there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a small start, but it's a start, and it gets your head thinking differently. Because after that, now you start going, well, why don't I just write up a procedure for that? So instead of having them come and ask me how it's done, why don't I just write it up? Yeah. And then they can read the manual instead of coming to me.
That makes sense. So that's for the short term. I really thanks for sharing that tip, that first exercise they can do. What are the other kind of low hanging fruits that they can start working on over like a 12-month period?
Yeah, well, so the low hanging
that's subjective, I guess, depending on.
It depends on the company. It depends on where they are in their evolution. It depends on what we identify as value gaps. But I would say that documentation is usually one of the big missings, right? And it's because you're growing your company, you're managing, you're making decisions. Everybody knows how things are done. And right away you can go, oh, no, let's do it that way instead. And it's all done. Right? And you never document it. You always go, I should really write that down and have it as a procedure, because it only happens 4 or 5 times a year, but it happens 4 or 5 times a year. That's 4 or 5 times that, something could break and you haven't documented. And to a buyer, that's important because a buyer can only look at documentation. And the example I used about meetings earlier, where I said, if you don't have minutes, you don't hold a meeting. The reason why a buyer feels that way is because if you're not keeping minutes, how do you track progress? How do you demonstrate how your management team works? What are the issues that are brought up on a regular basis? Is this weekly management team you talking for half an hour and everybody listening? Or is it a great exchange of different ideas and everybody brings their KPIs to the table? Without documentation, buyers can't verify what's actually going on. Right? So documenting sales process is the same thing, right? How did your sales process work? Well, we have 3 or 4 really good salespeople, and they all do it differently, and how do they do it differently? Well, I'm not sure, but Sam seems to have really good luck because he closes a lot of business. Well, again, to a buyer, that's just risk because it's not documented. It's not transferable. It's not sustainable.
What I'm hearing from you is this: is if it's not documented, then the buyer, they only have maybe year over year financial statements, or again, maybe quarterly snapshots at most, and then through the due diligence that they've done. But then now they have to go and they have to recreate the documentation. They don't know what has been effective. They don't know because that hasn't been transferred. So now it's a lot more involvement on their part. And I bet you that the valuation that they would want to buy the business for, because if that's a risk or that's something that they have to figure out, well, that's going to massively impact what they're willing to pay for. Instead of having this kind of all your T's crossed and your I's dotted, and you can show to the buyer like, hey, this is what we've been doing, this is the progress, this is what's effective, those are our metrics, those are our efforts. So if you just continue doing X, Y, and Z, well, your likelihood of generating that revenue and profit and whatnot is probably a lot higher.
Exactly, because buyers don't really care about past performance. I mean, they care to an extent, but
Right.
what they care about is what's future performance going to be like
Okay.
when I own it, right? So that's where I go back to transferable value, right?
Yeah. Makes
Everything
sense.
that's documented is transferable. Everything that's not
Yeah.
documented is not.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Talking about the relationship that you have, I know you're in Victoria, I'm in Victoria, and you've previously worked with kind of financial planners, financial advisors, and with their clients. Can you talk about that relationship, the benefits for the clients who are navigating this transition from your experience when they already had a financial planner, then they involve you as a business exit planner, and how that was able to help them reduce the stress, maximize the exit value, and really go through this experience that can be quite stressful, like in a seamless as
Yeah,
seamless
yeah,
as
yeah, yeah, yeah.
it can be. But can you describe the importance of having kind of those two roles really working closer together to help the
Yeah, yeah.
clients?
So as you said, I do a lot of work with wealth advisors and their clients, and the reason is pretty straightforward. You, as a wealth advisor, are trying to help the client maximize wealth over their lifetime and then through their retirements and everything else, right? And so you look at all their portfolios, how much cash is available, strategies, taxing, whatever, insurance, whatever that might be. A big piece of it, if they're a business owner, is 60, 70, 80% of their wealth is tied up in their business. Right. And again, you doing your planning with them and them wanting you to do their planning with them, say, how much is your company worth? And they very confidently say, I could sell this thing for $10 million tomorrow. And when the day finally comes, they're lucky to get two. Well, what does that do to all your to all your planning? So the value here for the wealth advisor and for their clients is that now we get a much more valid estimate of what the company is actually worth and what it could be worth. We've opened the eyes to your client about what their company is worth and what it could be worth and what needs to be done to get it ready. So that's my part in terms of I think what it also does is as I start to talk to clients about, the three different stages, that third stage really involves the wealth advisor because that's where you start looking at estate planning, tax strategies, insurance strategies, all of those things that are going to take place concurrently with the business still inactive, but really setting up for the day when they're not active in the business. Right. So it's kind of like I always say exit planning is a team sport. And wealth advisors, exit planners work really well together, but we have to throw in there the CPA and the lawyer and the tax person because at some point in that whole process, all of those professionals have to come in and work together.
Yeah. Yeah, no. And then when you see the third, you talk about the transferable value. First being profit and cash flow, second is growth, third transferable value.
Yeah, because then you're
Yeah.
looking at, well, the other thing about exit planning is there's a company component and there's an owner component. The company component has to do with the revenue, the profit, the growth, the IP protection, the market. But the owner part of it has to do with how do you preserve as much of that wealth as possible
Oh yeah.
at
Yeah.
time of transaction. And that's not my role. That's where I
So we
turn to
can.
that's your role when you're coordinating that whole piece. Right? And so, but there's nothing to coordinate if they haven't got a valuable company. So the key is make sure that we start with the foundation. Make sure they've got a valuable company that is sellable, that you feel more confident in terms of your projections and all the stuff.
Mhm. And then make sure that you're well positioned, that you're working, let's say on my end, I'm working closely with the accountant. If there are restrictions and lawyers as well, but if there restrictions needs to be done, depending on how they're going to sell the company. Are they selling the assets? Are they selling the shares? Do they
Big
want to
difference.
use the lifetime capital exemption? Are they even, is it possible to qualify for it as well? Like make sure they pass all the tests, all that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. Yeah, there's a lot that going on. Is it purified and all that? Yeah.
and we know that a lot of the tax decisions that they made while they were running their company, that their CPA advised them to do to reduce their taxes, the day they start to sell those things, the government kind of goes, okay, I get that back,
Yeah.
right? Give me those
Yeah.
back. Because,
Yeah.
yeah, and you got to be aware of those and start to extricate yourself from those
Yeah.
sooner than later.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Okay. I want to finish here with some rapid fire questions.
Okay.
What's the biggest mistake business owners make when thinking about selling?
I mention it often. The fact that they think they've got revenue and profit, therefore somebody's going to buy their business. Not the case.
They might want to buy it, but it might not be the price that they're willing to get it for. Even not even at all. That's what you're
Even not
saying.
at all. I mean, honestly, statistics are that
That's great.
80% of small businesses that go, in my
Yeah.
small businesses, like under $50 million, that go to market, 80% of them don't even sell. Never mind selling at a
Is
discount. They just
that
don't
is
sell.
that is wow, and they're profitable. Like
And they're profitable, but they've got,
they're a suitable buyer. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
And what was the other statistic I saw the other day that was equally frightening? Oh, yeah. So you know that there's a thing called the silver tsunami coming, right? Where all of these baby boomers in
Oh
their
yeah.
60s, 70s are all going to be exiting their businesses. And so buyers, it's going to be a buyer's market. Buyers are going to, there's a famous
Yeah.
quote by Branson, the guy from Virgin. He says, business deals are like buses. He says, there's always another one coming. Right. And so for buyers, your business has to stand out above the rest because if they see anything they don't like, it's like, okay, that one is, there's another one.
We'll wait for the next one.
There's another one I can look at. So you want to make sure that your business really stands out. It's like selling, I use real estate analogies a lot. It's like selling a house. If it's a buyer's market, your house has to stand out.
Yeah. Especially, I mean, we're in one right now. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. What one metric should every owner track monthly?
Yeah, I saw. There is no one metric. It depends on your industry. It depends on your company. It's if you run your company on one metric, then you're in trouble.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Good answer.
So I wouldn't say there is a single metric. You got to have a bunch of them.
Smart answer. Smart answer. What's a sign your business is too dependent on you? I mean, you kind of alluded to that already, but if
Yeah,
you can't go on vacation,
everything comes to you.
close the loop. Okay. And what is the difference between revenue growth and enterprise value growth? I mean, you just summarize it.
Well, yeah, what's the difference? Is that one puts money in your pocket today. The other one puts 5 times more money in your pocket 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now when you sell. Right. So it's a matter of whether you're building an asset or whether you're just got a job.
Yeah. That's a
Nice
big
job.
Yeah.
A job with branding. That's really cool, but it's a job.
Yeah. Nothing wrong. It's just, it depends what your goals, depends what you value, depends of your ambition, career ambitions, business ambitions, business vision, mission, and all that stuff. Right.
I founded my company 27 years ago.
Yeah.
As a solopreneur, and I
Yeah.
never, ever, 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 ever wanted to have another employee in my life. Right. And I've done really well. I'm comfortable, but I don't have a business I can sell, but I know that. Right. So it was a conscious decision to have a lifestyle business.
And that's maybe more personal to you, but with that experience, if you had to do it again, would you have chosen the same path, or would you have pivoted and potentially built a sellable business?
No, I would have done exactly the way I did it because it's
That's what you
worked out
wanted.
really well for me. People ask me, because I work both corporate and this, right? And people ask me, which one's better? Is there one, this must be better. I said, the grass is not greener on the other side. It's just a different shape. And fortunately, in my consulting work, I've been hired on in corporate roles over an extended period of time. So I've gotten my taste back of the corporate world to realize that after a couple of years, I realized why I didn't want to be in the corporate world to doing this. But the grass is not greener on the other side. It's just a whole different, it depends on what your ambition is. But no, I would never want to. I run companies and it's very stressful, and this is much better for me anyway.
And you focus on, and you focus now on being not now, but you've focused your career on being a business exit advisor, and you really enjoyed it. That's amazing that you would choose the same path. I'm still, a couple decades before you, but I am a solopreneur, and I do think about those questions, every day, and we'll see where it leads. But the fact that you said that the grass is just a different shade is very much true. I was in corporate as well, and there are huge trade-offs. Now, autonomy, like there's a lot of perks of what I'm doing, huge benefits, but they come I would say at a very, very steep cost that I think people on the corporate side sometimes might not know about. Until you went through it, it's a different world. So I think there's no right, the stability and security. I mean, that comes down the road, but in your earlier years, it needs to be established. Versus in the corporate, it's just given to you, and you trade your autonomy for it.
Certainly, when you're running your own business, the stress and the pressures can be a lot more than when you're in the corporate world. And so, if you don't have the makeup to handle that, you're not. If you think you're leaving the corporate world and starting a company so that you'll have an easier life, it's not going to be an easier life.
Well, yeah, that is and that's yeah, it's not gonna be easier. That's for sure.
Yeah,
All
but
right.
could be just and more rewarding.
I would, yeah, I would never go back, but I just, yeah, I love the journey. You need to really, really love, and the great thing is that it will test you, because if you don't love it, you're gonna give up. So you really need to enjoy the process and endure the highs and endure the lows. The highs are easy, but endure the lows and the challenges and overcoming each obstacles.
Yeah, because you're right. Sometimes the lows are pretty low.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Gerry, I think this is all the questions I had today for you, and I want to thank you for your time and coming on the podcast. I really
My
enjoyed
pleasure.
our conversation. Where can people find you? I'll put the links in the show notes.
Yep. Well, so you have my email address.
Yes.
That's the best way. And my LinkedIn profile is the best place to go see who I am, what I do. As you know, I write a lot about this topic, and happy to chat with anybody who's got questions, issues. Always happy to have a conversation.
Awesome. Thank you very much, and wish you, yeah, great rest of your day and great rest of your week.
Thank you very much.